Hello, and welcome to today's lesson. We are doing the second lesson on American national parks. If you're ready, let's get started. In this unit on national parks, we are trying to answer the question, how do America's national parks reflect the history of the United States? Specifically today, we will see that it is a disputed history. Let's have a look at this first document. It is entitled, We Are the Owners, les propriétaires. We are the owners. And we can see that there is a legend which reads, Blackfeet Native Americans in the Two Medicine area of Glacier National Park, Montana, circa 1914. The Blackfeet are a tribe of Native Americans. Native Americans in French would be les Indiens d'Amérique. The Two Medicine area, an area is a zone, a region of Glacier National Park. We saw that last time. It is in Montana. And this photo was taken circa 1914. Circa means we're not sure of the date. It might be 1913 or 1915, but you know, it's around circa about 1914. In this photograph, even though it's 1914, there's no indication of modernity. On the contrary, we can see, Native Americans from the back, but we recognize them because of the big headdress that some of them are wearing with a lot of feathers. They are mounted on horseback. They are riding horses. And in the background, right there, you can see some sort of a tent, which would be a teepee. That's a traditional tent of Native Americans. And they look to be on a riverside or maybe a lake. There's some teepees in the background as well. It's by a forest of pine-looking trees, in the foothills of a mountain. So let's have a look at the second picture, shall we? In this picture, we have a closer shot on the teepees. We see quite a lot of people. Some of them are very small, maybe children. We see two, I'm going to say horses. I'm not too sure, but it's probably horses here. Again, there's this lake or very big river and the mountains that have some woods on them. And the legend of the picture reads, Blackfeet people on the shore of Two Medicine Lake, 1900. So it's the same tribe, the Blackfeet people, on the shore, sur le rivage, sur la rive du lac, du coup, of Two Medicine Lake. So Two Medicine Lake, apparently Two Medicine is the name of the lake. And this time it's 1900. So it's a little, it's 14 years, about 14 years before the first photograph that we saw. But again, there's no real sign of modernity anywhere in sight. It looks like these people have lived in this region for hundreds of years, maybe. They look to be, living in the traditional way of their people, and it's probably their homeland. So now I'd like you to watch this video from, the National Park Service, and I would like you to tell me who are the protagonists of the negotiation. What happened during the negotiation, and what was the end result of the negotiation? Let's have a look at the video.
We then didn't see the land that you call the park, we didn't see that as a place for exploitation of natural resources. It was a place of our homeland. In September of 1895, late September, the government sent new treaty commissioners to meet with the people, and they called them all together. They said, we come to buy some of that land up there, those rocks, those mountains. And one of the leaders stood up and he said, well, we don't want to sell you any more land. And after 4 days, it looked like no agreement was going to be reached. And finally something happened that last night, and some kind of an agreement was made, and we ceded the land that you call Glacier Park to the federal government for $1.5 million.
Our people, they had different ways of recognizing that agreement that was signed. They says just the rocks was given to the people that wanted to do some mining. We just gave up the rocks, meaning the mountain. But after the agreement came out, it didn't come out that way.
So I firmly believe that we were hoodwinked out of that land.
So what would we say that area called Glacier National Park was? It was another chunk taken out of our full existence as a people. I think one of the real big impacts of why they sold the land, if they so sold it, is we had a starvation winter in 1883-84. I believe they thought that the money would provide resources for them to survive. Our people were literally starving to death.
We were put out of that. We were refused the rights within the Glacier National Park. And today we can't, the only right that we have now is to go through the park without paying. But we can't go in there and hunt. We can't go in there and use the wooded areas. It's, we're all deprived from that, just because of that agreement.
Today, the Blackfeet people still believe very strongly that we are the owners of Glacier National Park. We still believe very strongly that the spirits of our grandfathers and grandmothers occupy that land. We then didn't see the land that you call the park, we didn't see that as a place for exploitation of natural resources. It was a place of our homeland. In September of 1895, late September, the government sent new treaty commissioners to meet with the people, and they called them all together. They said, we come to buy some of that land up there, those rocks, those mountains. And one of the leaders stood up and he said, well, we don't want to sell you any more land. And after 4 days, it looked like no agreement was going to be reached. And finally something happened that last night, and some kind of an agreement was made, and we ceded the land that you call Glacier Park to the federal government for $1.5 million.
Our people, they had different ways of recognizing that agreement that was signed. They says just the rocks was given to the people that wanted to do some mining. We just gave up the rocks, meaning the mountain. But after the agreement came out, it didn't come out that way.
So I firmly believe that we were hoodwinked out of that land.
So what would we say that area called Glacier National Park was? it was another chunk taken out of our full existence as a people. I think one of the real big impacts of why they sold the land, if they so sold it, is we had a starvation winter in 1883-84. I believe they thought that the money would provide resources for them to survive. Our people were literally starving to death.
We were put out of that. We were refused the rights within the Glacier National Park. And today we can't, the only right that we have now is to go through the park without paying. But we can't go in there and hunt. We can't go in there and use the wooded areas. It's, we're all deprived from that, just because of that agreement.
Today, the Blackfeet people still believe very strongly that we are the owners of Glacier National Park. We still believe very strongly that the spirits of our grandfathers and grandmothers occupy that land.
So I did ask you to take notes on this video. First of all, who were the people involved in the negotiation? Well, the people involved were the US government and the Blackfeet leaders. The negotiation, what happened? Well, it was in late September 1895. It took 4 days of talks with the envoys from the US government. Apparently the talks, they were going nowhere. And then suddenly they came to an agreement. And the Blackfeet decided to sell the mountain for mining exploitation. So they basically said, you can have the mountain, you can mine it, but this is our home, so we're staying. What was the end result? In the end, the Blackfeet lost all rights except passage, which they had for free, and they felt cheated. They got $1.5 million, but they lost their home. Now, from these documents, so there's 2 photographs and a video, you should be able to write a recap. This is what I offer you. After a traumatizing winter of starvation in 1883-84, the Blackfeet people feared for their survival. Yet, when in late September 1895, envoys from the United States government came to discuss an agreement concerning their ancestral homelands, they at first felt reluctant to agree. After intense talks, the Blackfeet leaders finally agreed to a deal to give the Americans access and mining rights to the mountains for $1.5 million. However, the American government rolled out a deal wherein the Blackfeet had sold the whole of the territory to them. The Blackfeet people felt cheated and to this day consider that they have been hoodwinked out of a land to which they feel a strong spiritual connection. They consider themselves the true owners of the Glacier National Park and don't agree that the deal agreed to by their ancestors was binding, as they did not agree to the conditions the US government decided to implement. Now, you realize that for a contract to be valid, both parties have to agree on the same terms. If I say, I will sell you a cup of tea for €1, this is the tea, and you say, okay, here is €1, you cannot say afterwards, well, I didn't want tea, I wanted coffee, so I'm just going to take coffee from you. On the contrary, I cannot change the price after you've agreed to the contract. So you need to agree on the same thing. If you don't, the contract is invalid, which means that, for example, the person who paid the money will get their money back and will give back the object of the contract. Does that make sense? I hope it does. So that is it for these documents. If you look in the book, there is another document which is a text. I do suggest you read it. It's very interesting. The text is accompanied by a photograph. Let's have a look at it. You can see that it is a canyon. It's got very reddish rock. And this is the Grand Canyon. You see the water down there, and on the right hand side of the picture, it looks like little windows in a wall. So it looks like there was maybe a village constructed right in the cliff by some people who probably created a path to be able to go down to the river and to be able to move around, which is kind of amazing. And it looks very old. It looks ancient. That means people were there hundreds and hundreds of years ago. So let's have a look at the text then. National parks are beautiful, but the way they were created isn't. From Anne Elizabeth Tidnam for Timeline, August 26th, 2016. Let's read the text. On August 25, 1916, 100 years ago, President Woodrow Wilson created a National Park Service by establishing a new bureau in the Department of the Interior. Know what other bureau has always sat right alongside it? The Bureau of Indian Affairs. This is no small coincidence. We tend today to think of our national parks as sprawling natural treasures gifted to our country by the government, starting with Congress's Yellowstone Act of 1872, spurred on by the interests and legacy of Theodore Roosevelt. The Yellowstone Act began a global national park movement for which we are very grateful today, as scores of travelers enjoy the domestic wilderness and natural preserves they protect. But there's a whole lot they didn't protect at all. All of these lands were once inhabited by Indian tribes whose claims to ownership the federal government either ignored, invalidated, or did not recognize. Many of Americans' most beloved national parks were carved out of land originally belonging to Native Americans or intended as reservations: Glacier, Badlands, Mesa Verde, the Grand Canyon, and Death Valley. These chunks of land were forcefully taken from the Native American communities that lived within them as part of the United States government's larger efforts to relocate and remove them. The irony is that the very idea of Native Americans was part of the original inspiration for our national parks. In an uncomfortable twist of protectionism, painter George Catlin, famous for his Indian portraits and paintings of American wilderness, and one of the first voices advocating for national parks, expressed his belief that Native Americans should be protected as well. Or was it preserved? As Keller and Turek point out in American Indians in National Parks, in 1832, when Catlin conceived the idea of protecting the West in its pristine beauty and wilderness and wildness by creating a nation's park, he had hoped to protect the culture of plain Indians as well as to preserve grasslands, wolves, and buffaloes. One imagines, by some great protecting policy of government, a magnificent park where the world would see for ages to come the native Indian in his classic attire, galloping his wild horse with a sinewy bow and shield and lance amid the fleeting herds of elk and buffalo. Sounds an awful lot like a zoo, which begs the question, Is it worse to be removed from your ancestral land, attacked, humiliated, wounded, even slaughtered, and dumped somewhere hundreds of thousands of miles away, or to be exhibited and preserved in your natural splendor for visiting tourists to enjoy? This text begs some very interesting questions, and it gives you a very good overview of what national parks are and how they were created and what the idea behind them was. So this is it for today's lesson. I hope you had a good time. I did. And I will see you next time for activity number 3 on national parks. Bye. Take care.